It's a thrill to be able to discuss this crazy topic at Harvard Law School with you all. So I thought I'd change and discuss Section 553 of the Administrative Procedure Act. There have been some developments in the Sixth and Eighth Circuit, particularly in the last. Are you getting really scared? Is this okay? Okay, we'll stick with Star Wars. But what we're going to do after for the tape, and this part should not be public. Tape, blank yourself. Not like a bad word yourself. Just become blank. Okay, so we're going to do a tape with Section 553 of the Administrative Procedure Act. I'm scaring you again. Okay, Star Wars it is. That's familiar, yes? This is too. In case you forgot. This project came because my son, whose picture you're seeing, at the age of 5, he's now 8, got obsessed with Star Wars. And that was a big surprise. Why would just a random, well, I kind of introduced him to Star Wars, so he didn't just say, "What about Star Wars, Dad?" Nonetheless, the intensity of his interest in Star Wars startled me and got me to wonder, why did Star Wars succeed? So while I have an authoritative ranking of all the Star Wars movies, and I know a kind of catastrophically embarrassing number of facts about Star Wars, the issue for the day, and really the motivation for the project, is how did this series become so iconic, such that I was in Taiwan not terribly long ago to talk about legal questions, including the Administrative Procedure Act. And what they were really excited about was the Star Wars saga. It was all around, including by public officials. They wanted to talk about Star Wars. Okay, so the question of the success of Star Wars, I think, has general implications about when do rebellions generally succeed, such as #MeToo or Black Lives Matter. Why do politicians like President Trump and President Obama, both of whose success was highly improbable, according to real experts, how did that happen? Why do some products become astonishing market successes? Why do some ideas involving politics or social science take off? And why is this essentially unpredictable? Okay, the reason that is a puzzle is that Star Wars itself was not expected to be a success, and that some of the key plot developments in Star Wars that are celebrated now were a product of kind of on-the-spot debates which were resolved in ways that could have gone the other way. One of the most kind of moving debates over the Star Wars plot arc occurred before, actually during the writing of Return of the Jedi, in which the great Lawrence Kasdan said to George Lucas, "Luke Skywalker has to die." And George Lucas responded, Luke responded, "He's not going to die." And then Kasdan, a great screenwriter, really one of the best in American history, said, "Princess Leia has to die." And George Lucas said, "Princess Leia isn't going to die. It's not nice to go around killing people." And then Kasdan said, with his own, I think, artistic heart out front on the table, this was all recorded in real time, "George, you're missing something. The movie has more emotional weight if someone you love is lost along the way. The journey has a lot more impact on the audience." And Lucas responded, "I don't like that, and I don't believe that." I think that's a beautiful response because of the sequence. I don't like that, and I don't believe that, with not liking preceding not believing. Okay, so the Star Wars franchise has earned well over $60 billion. Its GDP, if that number were a GDP, would exceed the GDP of about 90 of the world's countries. If Star Wars was a nation and its earnings were its GDP, it would be about in the middle of the 193 nations on the planet. It lacks, as of now, its own seat at the United Nations, but Ambassador Nikki Haley, who knows, maybe she's considering proposing it. Star Wars would vote with the United States, and this is testimony to its economic and social power. Okay, no one expected, and this is an astounding fact, that it would be a hit. At Fox, which had the rights, there was apathy toward the project. They hoped a lot of times that it would just go away, and a lot of the executives had little faith in the film or in the director. In fact, their enthusiasm was so small at such late stages that once they saw the final clip, no one clapped and almost no one was smiling. So they were seeing A New Hope and thinking, oh my God, we have a disaster on our hands. They hoped for advance guarantees of $10 million. Even back then, that's pathetic. They only got a fraction of that, $1.5 million. They didn't even print enough celluloid to fulfill the early demand. In fact, the anticipated failure was such that they asked movie theaters to show their film. The movie theaters said no, and they had to say, well, we're not going to give you our other movie, The Other Side of Midnight. Have you ever heard of The Other Side of Midnight? Not a lot of people have. So we're not going to give you that one unless you show this one too. They had to bribe movie theaters, in fact, to show the film. And that $1.5 million was a result of an effort to avoid a catastrophic failure. George Lucas had more hope. He thought it might do as well as a standard Disney movie, but he himself was so ambivalent about the prospects for success that he went to Hawaii, partly to avoid the disappointment of a failure. And once the early returns came in that it was doing great in the first weeks, Lucas responded, there's a lot of science fiction fans out there, so it can do well in the first few weeks. Just wait. It's going to return to low numbers. That, of course, didn't happen, and the question is why. What we're going to do now is to explore a set of explanations, all of which are plausible, and I'm going to tell you in the end my preferred one. Here's the first, which bears on the success of almost anything, and it has to do with social influences on what becomes culturally iconic. There was a movie a few years ago, it won the Oscar, called Searching for Sugar Man, and it was about a Detroit singer-songwriter named Sisto Rodriguez. If some of you have heard of him, it's probably because of the movie, and I bet most of you haven't heard of him. How many of you heard of Rodriguez? Okay, really small fraction. Rodriguez in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, released two albums. He was thought to be pretty good by the studio, but he completely tanked and became a construction worker, which is what, at last accounting, he was, a demolition man in Detroit. He had some talent. In South Africa, he was iconic. They thought in South Africa that he was as good as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Dylan, and his demise was an enduring mystery. What happened to this genius of rock and roll? There were reports that he had burned himself on stage, that he had, for other maybe religious reasons, gone into seclusion. But one of the all-time greats in rock music history had completely disappeared after two spectacular triumphs. That's South Africa. In the United States, no one had heard of him. Okay, a little speculation about what happened in South Africa versus what happened in the United States is that in South Africa, he was the beneficiary of an early cascade of enthusiasm, and he was good enough that it completely took off. In the United States, he lacked that early cascade of enthusiasm such that he tanked. And then the theory would be what succeeds culturally, whether it's a book, a politician, an idea, or a musician, is often dependent on serendipity, whether there's early enthusiasm that breeds growing noise, which can lead something to produce, spectacular revenue or to produce essentially nothing, depending on something that's not quite a coincidence, but that's not much larger than a coincidence. That's one reading of what happened with Sisto Rodriguez. If it seems puzzling, then let's just notice that there was a novelist named Robert Gottlieb who produced a couple of good mysteries, actually more than a couple now, one of which was well reviewed but a critical failure. A popular failure, a critical success. Have you heard of Robert Gottlieb? He's actually the same person who wrote the Harry Potter novels. And once that was disclosed, Robert Gottlieb's novels vaulted to the top of the bestseller list because there was a social resonance, because it was the Harry Potter author. They're very good, these novels, but they were tanking economically until it was revealed that the author was someone known to be great. William Blake and Jane Austen, that's misspelled here to make sure you're paying attention, have a story that's not so radically different from the tale of Sisto Rodriguez, but it's about time rather than space. It's about slices of decades rather than geography. William Blake, one of the great poets in the English language, who was actually going to make some more appearances in these remarks, was thought in his time to be, not much, not so good. And Jane Austen was thought to be one of a trilogy of women novelists, as they were characterized, who were pretty good, but she wasn't necessarily the best. And the other two you've not heard of, William Blake is now in the canon. The fact that they got there, it is probably a necessary condition that they're great, but is not a sufficient condition that they're great. And both Blake and Austen were the beneficiary of something like what happened to Rodriguez in South Africa. That is, a cult is a little pejorative, but a set of enthusiasts who said Blake, 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 Austen, 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 and that eventually led to their current status. This suggests that with respect to the Cuckoo novels, cuckoo is not meaning crazy, but that's the name of the first one, and the Blake poems and the Austen novels, there are multiple equilibria. That is to say, in a parallel world, a world not radically different from our own, but in which the serendipitous enthusiasts failed or were insufficiently numerous, we would never have heard of Austen and Blake, and there would be others who would be occupying their space. If this seems not plausible, there's an empirical study of something called the Music Lab a few years ago, and it's been replicated in various ways with respect to political causes, that basically tests music popularity for a bunch of songs on a pretty obscure website. And what the authors of the experiment did was to have an independent condition in which everyone could download, let's say, a little bit of a song from a would-be Taylor Swift or Selena Gomez, and see what are you impressed that I know that? No, you're not. But and see if it's good, and then they could download it. And that would show you what people like, people who visit this site. In the treatment conditions, people were given the same opportunity, but with one difference. They could see how many in their randomly constructed group of visitors to the site, how many people had downloaded previous songs. So exactly the same as the control, and we could do that in this room, where you could all see how many people had previously downloaded songs. The prediction, if quality is the determinant, is that in the end, the most successful songs in the control treatment will end up being the most successful songs in every world. That social influence will ultimately be crushed by quality. So in any world that you run, though history is run only once, Taylor Swift is going to do great, Mona Lisa is going to be completely famous, and John Milton will be known as the greatest religious poet in the English language. That's just how it's going to happen. On the website, that's not what happened. While the best songs in the control condition never tanked, and the worst songs in the control condition never made it to the top, anything could happen. The second best songs could be catastrophes. The second worst songs could do super well, all depending on whether initially they were the recipients of popularity. So the theory for the success of cultural entities is that social influences really matter, and that there is information contained in the behavior of early movers. That's why Rodriguez did great in South Africa, not so well in the United States. There are reputational considerations that bear on what one is listening to and going to see. And there are network effects from which Star Wars, to complete the circle, spectacularly benefited. So recently, Anne Friedman, excellent writer, said, ultimately, I was going to see The Force Awakens because all my friends were going to see it. I was in the grip of a rare phenomenon, a true mass cultural event. Okay, so the first thesis is Star Wars is Rodriguez in South Africa, and Star Wars is William Blake in our contemporary literary canon. That is, it is great, but that it was, its success was very far from inevitable. A few things happened, all of which coalesced around the view that Star Wars is something everyone's going to see, which made actually everyone go to see it. The question about seriously is, how much should we weight the Music Lab experiment in the context of something whose quality arguably is through the roof? Rodriguez, the singer, is good, very good. He's not Bob Dylan. The question is Star Wars maybe Bob Dylan, with the counter thesis being, if you're Dylan or Star Wars or Shakespeare or Da Vinci, your success is going to occur in every one of those parallel worlds. Okay, a second account trying to earn the claim of quality would be that what makes Star Wars' success essentially inevitable is its multiple meanings. And this is something which Lucas did, which Rian Johnson, I'm pronouncing his first name like my daughter's name is Rian, I think it's Ryan Johnson, which Ryan Johnson did not succeed in doing, sad to say. What George Lucas did was to tell a story that had multiple meanings, many of which could be supported by the raw material. To see Star Wars as an essentially Christian tale that's playing on the tale of Jesus is fair. To see it as a Christian story of redemption, more on that later, is completely fair. That's there. To see it as a Freudian story with a strong Oedipal theme, that's on the surface. It's tracking Freud. The struggle between father and son, in which the son almost kills father, that's completely there. To see it as a feminist story, even the original ones, is not hard. Princess Leia kills her captor by strangling him, by the very material with which he imprisoned her. To see it as an Oedipal story, and this is the Freudian specification, is there also. To see it as a democratic story of rebellion with a big Jeffersonian theme is something which George Lucas was self-conscious about. Lucas also was interested in technology and depersonalization. It's no accident that the villain is half robot and all technologized. That's there also. And there are crazy theories, if you check the internet lately, about the new ones or the old ones, wild, which obsessive people are able to connect dots to make plausible. There are also mysteries and more mysteries in the original Star Wars stories, which are still being untangled. Okay, does that have explanatory power? Yes. The multiple meanings of the tale are part of their enduring appeal. But there are lots of stories out there that have multiple meanings, and that is not a sufficient condition for success. if you're a science fiction buff, you probably have read science fiction stories by author X, which have a zillion meanings, and they're awful, and you're the only one in the room who knows about them? Yes? Maybe not? Is that only true of me? Trust me, it's true. Which is to say that this is not, multiple meanings is not a sufficient condition, and it's not a necessary condition either. There are movies like The Godfather, which are culturally fabulous success stories, which are not full of multiple meanings and success and stories. They're great for other reasons. I think I'm going to bracket the pedantic word right now and just talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. Okay, the third explanation would say what made Star Wars succeed, and what's making the current ones succeed too, is that they hit a cultural moment. In the late 1970s, after the tumult of the Vietnam era, the assassination of the Kennedys, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and a malaise, as Jimmy Carter described the nation as in, it was kind of fated for success that a movie that was denominated The New Hope and kind of inculcated the idea of a new hope, that had that kind of ebullience and exhilaration, it was fated that it was going to do spectacularly well. And now you could say that both The Last Jedi and The Force Awakens are hitting a cultural moment for which they are spectacularly well-suited. I think the smartest people who are exploring the success of the Star Wars saga think that this is the right explanation, that George Lucas tapped into something, and Disney has now tapped into something, which is kind of a perfect storm for success. Okay, I think this is the worst explanation of all, even though it is the most tempting and intuitive. And the reason is it's always possible to construct, isn't it, an ex post Zeitgeist explanation. And it's always going to seem sensible, but who knows whether it's true. So to say after the attacks of 9/11 that Harry Potter and Taylor Swift a bit later would succeed is completely intuitive. That what was sought was either something very upbeat and kind of high energy exuberance, as in Taylor Swift until very recently, and to say that a story of good struggling against evil, where evil was kind of like a terrorist in Harry Potter, that also was going to succeed. But you can always give an account of that sort. Ask yourself whether in any decade, 2000s, the aughts, the 1990s, the 1950s, the 1940s, the 1930s, if we got historically rich about any of those periods and something like Star Wars succeeded, it would be child's play to say there was something in the culture of the time that made that inevitable. And that would not be an adequate explanation. That is to say, the Zeitgeist explanation might be true, but it's too convenient and simple to map on an era's anxiety to the cultural success of something to make that a kind of satisfactory account. Okay, the fourth explanation says what George Lucas got at, and which the new ones have failed to get at, I think, is the, what's the right word? The appeal of the dark side. And though the Star Wars movies are in a way a cartoon, George Lucas tapped here into something that is in every human heart. William Blake, back to Blake, who I think is in some ways, even if indirectly, a big influence on the Star Wars movies, wrote, the reason John Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. It's worth pausing over that. That's, in a way, a scary thing to say, isn't it? But it does capture something, I think, about true poetry and about the, what's the right word, the, I'm going to ponder over the right word and just notice another phrase from Blake. Those who restrain their desires do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. That's Sith talk, but it's getting at, I think, something of the, these words aren't quite there, but they're in the vicinity, the ecstasy and the eroticism of the dark side. Lucas is onto those. Lydia Millett, in a great essay, writes about Vader that he's the only erotic figure in the Star Wars family and the only tragic one, and for that reason he's a terrible beauty. The only question Star Wars posed to the audience really is the Darth Vader question. I don't think that's quite true, but it's the most intriguing question. And Millett says Vader has an erotic charge because he gets what he wants. He makes the dark side seem sexy. Lucas is on to that. And even for kids, the appeal of the movie lies partly there. Is that relevant? Absolutely. But remember the pedantic words about necessary and sufficient conditions? There are plenty of movies that make the dark side seem appealing that you've never heard of. And there are plenty that don't do that have done spectacularly well. So this is part of the greatness of the movies, but this isn't enough. I just got, believe it or not, something very cool and kind of perfect, which says the virus protection isn't working anymore. This is right the moment for it. Okay, fathers, sons, and redemption. This is a Christian theme, but there's also something Freudian here. And with respect to my own son, and I think many boys here who remember struggles with dads, but maybe this will capture a gender-neutral experience also. There's something that Star Wars is onto that George Lucas was just speaking autobiographically all over because of his own struggles with his dad. For any kid, a dad at some point is large and mysterious and powerful and occasionally frightening. Even the kindest father at one time or another seems like that. Isn't it so? Anakin, with respect to the kind of central dynamic of the Star Wars 6 movies, ends up saving his son because he can't bear to see his son die in a way that belies the nominally stoic theme of the Star Wars movies spoken by Yoda, which involve the importance of detachment. Anakin, who loses to the dark side and the Sith because he can't stand his mother's death and then his beloved's death. It's the fear of loss that leads to intolerable grief that leads him to the dark side. I think there's something psychologically very acute about that. That's where Yoda wins, that detachment is necessary to avoid the kind of fear of loss that leads to hatred and rage and anger. But in the end, Lucas, miraculously, I think, and this is real artistry, says Yoda's wrong and turns it all on its head, where Anakin's redemption is not, his redemption is what doomed him. His redemption comes from the fear of loss of his son. He gives up all of his life's work with the Sith because he can't bear to see his boy die. Luke, for that matter, ends up saving his father, not from a kind of death, kind of Star Wars Jedi death. He tries, he fails. Remember at the end of Return of the Jedi, he says, I have to save you, Father. And in a heartbreaking, especially for a cartoonish movie, heartbreaking words, Anakin, referred to for the first time in the last three of the first three, as Anakin in the script. For the first time, he's Anakin now. He says, you already have. Okay, there's a connected theme with redemption here, and it has to do with agency and freedom. And that's the beating heart of the Star Wars movies, and that's, in the end, what makes, I think, a necessary condition for its particular kind of success. What the much maligned prequels do is put Anakin Skywalker in exactly the mirror situation that Luke Skywalker is in the first release trilogy. They are cinematically almost the same, and they are, in terms of their dialogue, very, very close, where the satanic figure, the Emperor, is trying to lead a young man to the dark side, and he's doing so by asking him to make a choice. For all their power, the Sith believe in one thing, and it seems almost like a theological commitment, which is freedom of choice. Yoda says, chose this, Anakin did, emphasizing that his fall to the dark side was a matter of voluntary decision. Why does he do that and Luke doesn't? Is it because his losses were more searing? Probably. Okay. The Emperor, the Sith Lord, insists that everything is foreordained, saying repeatedly, everything is happening as I have foreseen. Yoda, by contrast, says everything always in motion is the future. So the secret meaning of Star Wars is that as every kid wishes and hopes, any parent, and I'm talking to everyone in this room, is likely to, probably would, risk his life to save yours, even if it means a contest with the Emperor. And when he does, the Force is going to be right there with him. So Anakin's dying words, violating his constant rejoinders to Luke's claims there's good in you, his dying words are, tell your sister you were right about me. Lawrence Kasdan, very recently, the defeated Lawrence Kasdan, trying to explain the appeal of Star Wars, basically nailed it, saying it's the biggest adventure you can have making up your own life, and it's true for everybody. It's an infinite possibility. It's like, and now Kasdan's not a youngster, it's like, I don't know what I'm going to do in the next 5 minutes, but I can feel I can get through it. It's an assertion of a life force. So Star Wars is primal, and it's a fairy tale, but it's not a mere retelling of Joseph Campbell's story of a hero with 1,000 faces on which Lucas relied. It is that, but it's more superficial and it's deeper. Its real topic is the fork in the road and the decision you make on the spot. It pays tribute to the importance of distance and detachment, but it has a rebel heart, which makes it, I think, a distinctly American tale, embracing attachments to particular people, even when the Emperor is throwing lightning bolts. So at the decisive moments, this is what kids say, I'm a Jedi like my father before me. Sure, it resonated with its time. It definitely benefited from cascaded network effects. But it was bound to succeed. It's just too good. I like that, and I believe it. Thanks. So questions, comments? An authoritative ranking of all of the movies, including Last Jedi?
Raise your hand so we can see you.
So I guess how would you see the anthology films like Rogue One fitting into this whole narrative?
Okay, so Rogue One seems to me a triumph, and an extremely implausible triumph. The little moments before A New Hope should not have been a basis for a good movie. Who would have thought to make a movie based on that? And nonetheless, it's a spectacular success, I think. And one thing that makes it successful, of course, is the spoilers. Rogue One isn't recently out. If you haven't seen it, just play some really loud song in your head. Can you do that? Okay, so the last moments of Rogue One that unite the plot of that movie with the beginning of A New Hope, it's brilliantly done. And the fact that it completes a circle like that, something deeply satisfying about that. Also, it maintains continuity with two of Lucas's great themes. One is children and their parents, and it does a kind of play, and here with female lead, on what Lucas did about goodness of dads and connection between heroic, maybe not, parents and undauntable children. It's how they really thought it through. They got Star Wars. They got Lucas on that. Also, freedom of choice at every stage is, which I think makes it a distinctly American film, though of course it resonates all over the world. But freedom of choice at every stage, that's completely in Rogue One. And what Kasdan said, Lawrence Kasdan, Lucas's collaborator, said about, in explaining the appeal of Star Wars, one of the things he said, it moves like a son of a bitch. And the prequels, we can say, can't we, they don't move like a son of a bitch? Rogue One does. And so everything good about Star Wars, they got in that. How to do that for other movies that aren't part of the story it's extremely challenging. But they did it for Rogue One. And the sad fate, spoiler alert, the sad fate of our heroes, there's something that is continuous in that with what Lucas had to say about rebellions and democracy and authoritarianism and about tragedy. And somehow the fact that the choice was made, and that's signaled in the last kind of heartbreaking scene, that it was a reflection of freedom, makes it not only sad. Rogue One is in the pantheon.
So I'm wondering what you think about Star Wars enabled it to kind of survive the prequels, which, as you mentioned, are much maligned. So why are we still excited about new Star Wars rather than dreading, more prequel-like movies?
Okay, let's go back, if we can, to 2014 and think if we're trying to rank not Star Wars movies, but all movies ever. Okay, let's suppose we're doing that, and we're being completely objective, including Orson Welles and Martin Scorsese and all the greats. Okay, the first has to be The Empire Strikes Back, doesn't it? That's the greatest movie ever made. The second has to be A New Hope. That's the second best movie ever made. And while it's not obvious what the third greatest movie ever made is, Return of the Jedi turns, on reflection, that's the third greatest movie of all time. Now, if you're thinking of the fourth greatest movie of all time, it would be Revenge of the Sith, because of the amazing ending of that movie and the psychological warfare between dark side going Anakin, the Emperor, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. The fifth would be Attack of the Clones. The sixth would be The Phantom Menace. The seventh would be Citizen Kane. The eighth would be Raging Bull. The ninth would be Chariots of Fire. The 10th is, so this is a long way of saying I kind of like the prequels. But most people don't. There are a few things to say. One is to say that the prequels were an economic success, and they did resonate with kids. So they put an imprint on a generation. The other thing to say is that even if they were, let's say, not as good as just stated, the first release trilogy was so spectacularly good that the rebirth would attract keen attention, even if the prequels are just like better that they did. This is not my view, but for those who think better that they didn't happen, it's as if they didn't happen. And then the new ones would do great, even decades later. So I'll tell you, I had a book tour after my book came out, and a confession, a law professor who has a book tour, it's better than walking on snow naked with your feet just pouring into the ice, but it's not a lot better than that. A book tour is unfun. But the Star Wars thing was completely fantastic. So I could tell you 100 stories. I could tell you 300 stories about people and their experience with Star Wars. And here we're not talking about the prequels. So, I worked for President Obama. I'm not very right of center. I think that's fair to say. I spoke at some very conservative group that was keenly interested in Star Wars. And the guy came up to me with, I think you wrote a book about Star Wars, you might be okay. You work for President Obama, that's not so good. And I said to him, are you a Star Wars fan? And he said, oh, yeah. And I said, do you have children? And he said, yes. And I said, did you watch Star Wars with them? And he said, I'll tell you a story. My boy was in the hospital. He had a brain tumor as a kid. And he was in the hospital for a long time, and the first thing I did was to take him out of the hospital the day he left. I took him right to a Star Wars movie that happened to be playing. And the guy was of indeterminate age. He could have been 35. He could have been, believe it or not, 65. I couldn't tell from his face or his body how old he was. He's one of those men. And so I had no idea how old this kid was. And I said, does your kid remember that? Bracketing the age question and the illness question. He said, oh, yeah, completely. And I said, how's he doing? And he said, he's great. And I said, where is he? He said, oh, he's 40 now. He's completely fine. And he said, would you sign a book over to him? And he was almost in tears at that moment, and me too. And if I could, I would have given him my suit. And for him and his 40-year-old kid, that was a defining thing. And there are people all over the country for whom the original three, certainly, have that hold on their relationship with their parents, their psyches. So I think that's why the new ones were going to connect. And The Force Awakens, I'm not sure what you all think about The Force Awakens. It does have a kind of Star Wars by the books quality. It doesn't have the genius of George Lucas, who just, both his reading and his visual imagination, we don't really have anything like that, I don't think. J.J. Abrams doesn't have that, but he has competence through the roof and diligence of the highest kind. And so The Force Awakens was able to, it did replicate a lot of the earlier plot, especially in New Hope, but it did so with the kind of exuberance and light determination that made it work, I think.
Just two questions. One, what order do you think the movies should be watched in? And two, what do you think of Luke Skywalker's development as a character in The Last Jedi, as opposed to his character in the first three movies?
Okay, so great questions. So here's the authoritative order in which to watch them. It's simple. Release order. George Lucas says episode order, and to disagree with George Lucas about Star Wars is extremely hazardous. But if you watch them in episode order, you miss the reveals, and the reveals are crucial. There are other orders, machete order, which some people in the audience, about. Everyone knows about machete order, yes? Okay, that is trying to excise part of one of the maybe less successful movies, but I think Release Order is the best. I was disappointed by Luke's development. I think The Last Jedi is a good movie, and so much work was put into it, and thinking and cinematic but I don't think Rian Johnson gets Star Wars. And I'm saying that, this is being taped. So I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson. I don't think you get Star Wars. Luke is a gee whiz kind of a guy. That tossing of the lightsaber over the shoulder early, there's something gutsy about him doing that. That's not Luke, and it takes a moment away that should have had resonances. There was something, for those of you who haven't seen it, I won't spoil, there's something ingenious and surprising and cool that happens. But what happens in the end to Luke, I'm with George Lucas. Some of you are going to get that. I don't think it has continuity with the Luke of the first three. It's hard. One possibility is that J.J. Abrams and his collaborators would have done better because they were more immersed, I think, in what George Lucas was all about. But 9 might be incredible. So.
What's your opinion of the father-son relationship between this guy behind you?
This guy behind me? It didn't end well, did it? So the fact that Kylo Ren just kills Han Solo, it's too random. And it didn't have the searing quality, except if you loved Han Solo, of the relationship between Luke and Darth Vader. It didn't have the background and the mystery. It had a mystery, but it didn't have the mystery. So it had a random quality. And it also, I had a friend who I went to see it with. She went to the bathroom and cried for 10 minutes after the movie and said, I'm not going to see any of these movies ever again. They killed Han Solo. And why do that to people? So it didn't have the, the associations and the size. It just seemed like a petulant guy's killing his dad. Now, that maybe on one view that was necessary to build something about Kylo Ren that would be super interesting, but it doesn't look like they're getting there. So we want to be positive about all things Star Wars, but Lucas did better.
Well, thanks again. Let's all give a round of applause. Thank you, Professor Sunstein.